I'm Christopher Rufo, the director of the Center on Wealth and Poverty here at Discovery. We're starting with the next session. This is going to be a session, we have teleconferencing in from the Washington, D.C. area. A friend of Discovery, Ed Moy. Ed was the director of the United States Mint between 2006 and 2011. He has a long track record in business and public service and advising private equity. So he is someone who fundamentally understands how money works. And there's almost nothing that influences our lives more than money, monetary policy, and economic activity associated with it. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Ed to the screen. Again, he's going to be dialing in from the Washington, D.C. area. I'd like Ed to give a brief presentation on the story of money for the next 10 or 15 minutes. Then we'll have a conversation virtually and then take some questions.
Thanks so much, Chris. And even with that great introduction, I don't have any free samples to give you from the United States Mint. I think one of the things that I'm proudest of, you know, people normally ask, you were at the Mint for 5 years, which things did you do that are most memorable? And I would have to say, you know, I could either say turning the Mint around from 2.3 billion of revenue to almost 5 billion, increasing our profits over $1 billion at the Mint, to raising us from near bottom of employee satisfaction to near the top. But the one that I'm most proudest of is I finally got my dad off my back. Him being a immigrant Chinese from the mainland of the old traditional viewpoint, was always disappointed with all my side tours of duty into public service. He thought I didn't make enough money there. And when I finally told him I was going to become director of the Mint, he said, my son, finally, he's going to get a job where he makes a lot of money. So I didn't have the heart to tell him that none of that money was mine, that it was on behalf of the American taxpayers. And in addition to that, I didn't even get a discount off my own services. So before I begin, I just also wanted to say thank you to Discovery Institute, in particular, my friends George Gilder and Bruce Chapman for all they do, Steve Burai for his leadership. I've been a great admirer of Discovery and relish the time that I have to interact with them, because it always expands my horizons. And so it's a special treat for me today to be with all these fellows here today, thinking that I might have something to share that would be interesting and informative. So I've been asked to speak about the story of money, and I thought that I would just give you 5 quick vignettes. Many of you, especially my age, remember a movie maybe 20 years ago called Four Weddings and a Funeral. And today my story of money is going to go through 4 births and a death. So without any further ado, I just want to give you these vignettes and then save plenty of time for interaction afterwards, so I can address the questions that you might have. So the first story I want to tell you is a birth, and it's the birth of coins. We first discovered what we would distinguish between a token and an actual coin, and that was in modern day Turkey, and these date back to a country back then called Lydia, and these were basically very consistent weights with very consistent designs. And so it's basically, the first one we found was a design of a royal lion, and it was on one end of the coin, and on the other end there was a big hole. And that was because in order to make coins back then, it seemed they would take the metal, which in this case was electrum. Electrum is naturally occurring gold, and it's usually found with silver in it. and it's very soft. Both gold and silver are very soft. And so what they would do is find these nuggets, make sure that they're all similar size. They would put them in a mold with a hammer and chisel, put the chisel in the back of the nugget, and then strike it. And that would imprint the design on the front and create the dent in the back. How do we know that these were likely coins? Well, mainly because of the consistent designs and the consistent weights. So there were different weights of these, and they just weren't random weights. So certain designs had certain weights, and it was initially speculated that these were basically offerings at a temple. Well, it didn't take long because Lydia was part of the Greek Empire. It didn't take long for this idea of coins to spread to Greece, and then eventually when the Roman Empire came into its heyday, coins had come of age and it become fairly commonplace in the ancient world. So why was the birth of coins so important? Well, in one way it eliminated, so we don't know much about how commerce was done 700 BC and before. There's not a lot of documentation. There's some notations where people would store grain in certain depositories and use that to trade, etc. But there was really nothing that mentioned how things were bought and sold. And so the most common theory that's out there, and it's just a theory because, again, we don't have a lot of facts, is that commerce was mainly done through bartering. And if you assume that to be the case, the problem with bartering, and the reason why bartering holds back an economy, is that you have to depend on the double coincidence of needs. So what that means is if I want to buy shoes and I raise chickens that lay eggs, I have to time it pretty well to bring eggs to the shoemaker at a time when he needs the eggs, at a time when I need the shoes. So you have to have these two needs and the coincidence of them happening at the same time. Otherwise, if the shoemaker is not looking for eggs, but he's looking for lumber, I have to go to the person that has lumber and try to trade eggs for enough lumber that the shoemaker would accept. And if that wasn't the case, and the lumber maker wanted cloth, linen cloth, you could see how complicated transactions could be. And what coins ended up doing is, because coins were made, in this case, of precious metal, both gold and silver, which had value prior to this. So you can go as way back to the very first pharaoh, the legend, and in the pharaoh's code had mentioned a ratio between gold and silver because gold was used for artistic purposes. It was pounded into a gold leaf that was used on buildings, etc. And so there's already a set value for gold, and there was already a determination as back as the beginning of Egypt that gold and silver secondarily had intrinsic value, had other uses because money wasn't invented then. And so the idea was, how can I take whatever I have, trade it for something of intrinsic value, and it's now a store of value that is widely acceptable, that I can now use that to buy other things with. And it was really evident that from about 500 BC on, economies started to really grow. And trade, international trade began happening with earnest at that time, and it can all be traced to the birth of coins. So that's my first birth. My second one is birth of the gold standard. So fast forward to the early 1700s, we have Sir Isaac Newton, who is obviously a very famous scientist. But what people didn't know was he was very productive for a short period, and then he had a huge nervous breakdown that he never really came back from. And his niece, who ended up being a mistress to the exchequer in England, which is basically the Secretary of Treasury, convinced the exchequer to hire her unemployed uncle as the director of the Royal Mint. And why that was important was even though Sir Isaac Newton was diminished because of his nervous breakdown, he still was a really bright guy. And so he just threw himself into this job of being the mint director. And one of his key initiatives was seeing that one of the areas of expertise was alchemy, which was which would be today modern day chemistry. But back then, one of the purposes of alchemy was to try to recreate gold and silver in a lab. And so Sir Isaac Newton, now with government funding, went into alchemy with all his intellectual power and tried to recreate gold and silver. And when he couldn't, he determined that all the gold and silver, because it couldn't be made, all that exists in the ground. And then he proceeded to try to figure out what the ratio was to how much gold versus how much silver. And through his calculations, he came up with roughly a 1:16 ratio. And so there would be 16 ounces of sterling silver, which was 0.925 pure. Sterling silver equaled 1 ounce of pure gold. And that's why even today, one of the more common names for the British pound is the British pound sterling, because 1 pound of sterling was equal to 1 ounce of gold. And the set value of that, he determined, and then I translate into US dollars, was the equivalent of $20. So $20 for an ounce of gold, and then you divided that by 16 to get what the cost or the price of silver is. And with that, because it was such a scientific method, almost all the developed countries at the time adopted this gold standard. And so even here in the United States, from the founding of our country to 1933, we valued gold at $20 an ounce. And so if you were to make a $20 gold, if you're going to make a $20 coin, that coin had to have 1 ounce of gold in it. That was the standard of how we interpreted it here in the United States. And so once you ended up with that standard, you eliminated basically very arbitrary exchange rates that weren't, they didn't have Bloomberg terminals to figure all this stuff out back then. And that really helped facilitate commerce as well as international trade, to the point where you can now point to the period of time that the gold standard existed, when Sir Isaac Newton came up with the gold standard, to about 1933, as the most economically expansive period of time in the history of man. And it can all be traced back to the birth of the gold standard. So let me add another birth on here, and that is the birth of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. So when you have gold as your standard, and people deposit that gold in a bank, banks want to make money off of that, and so they speculate off of those deposits, and they also loan off those deposits and charge an interest rate, which is how they make their return. And the laws back then allowed for fractional reserve banking, which is being able to use that deposited dollar in multiple loans. We saw that in the movie It's a Wonderful Life, where you get a really good example of fractional reserve banking. That part of that deposit is part of this person's house and that person's house. And the problem was confidence. So whenever a bank was subject to a rumor or had some financially difficult times, the downside of that is people would panic and they would want to withdraw all their money. Well, of course, the bank didn't have everybody's deposits fully covered for all the loans that were set out. And people knew that, and so they wanted to be first in line to get their money out. And so there's a huge banking crisis of 1907, of which many major banks were involved in that. And the problem that ensued was the federal government did not have enough money to loan to those banks to bring up the confidence. They had to go to a private banker, J.P. Morgan, and convince him to save the country's banking system. And then he pulled together a bunch of his rich friends, of which then they loaned money to the troubled large banks and saved the system. But at that point, the federal government came to the conclusion that we have some systemic risk here if we have to depend on a private banker to save the national banking system. And so as a result, the Federal Reserve Bank was set up as the most current, and still is the current version of a central bank. In the United States, we've had several iterations of central banks, of which the Federal Reserve is the latest and the longest lasting. And so the Federal Reserve started as the lender of last resort. So their main mission, why they were created, was to provide stability to the financial system. And as we will soon see, their role has evolved to encompass monetary policy, which is they are in charge of determining how much currency should be in the system and either shrinking or growing the money supply in order to influence economic policy for three main ends. What they want to do is to maximize employment, is to provide for stable prices, and they're also looking at how best to have very low long-term interest rates. And because of this role, they've also gotten into regulation. So now they can regulate how much reserves each of the banks have to have based on their loaning ratios and a number of other things. And mainly because of checking, they had to develop and facilitate a payment and settlement system, which the Federal Reserve still maintains a critical role in the ACH settlement system, of which the volume has significantly decreased over the last 25 years as most consumers and businesses are writing and accepting less checks. So let me talk about the first death. This will give you a very sobering view of how we got to where we are today. So, you know, the pros of the gold standard was it was widely accepted. You didn't need necessary exchange rates. Everybody based their value of their currency on 1 ounce of gold. And then from there, the only problems you had were shocks to the gold supply, meaning Australia would find a new vein of gold, and that would be significant. And all of a sudden, Australia would increase its national wealth before it distributed all that gold. And so those things would kind of shock the system and cause a little bit of inflation when the money supply increases that rapidly. And then second, you had a problem in that if you wanted to fight a war, if you were under the gold standard, you had all the money that could be backed by gold or is gold out there, and you didn't have anything left over. And so if you wanted to fight a war, you had to borrow money and then eventually pay it back with gold, and that could be very expensive. And so on one hand, it would make a country think twice about going to war. On the other hand, they went to war all the time at the drop of a hat back then, and you ended up with these huge debts among countries that caused economic tension between those countries and pressure on the system. So roughly at about this time, early 1900s, mainly in the 20s, was the rise of a young economist. His name was John Maynard Keynes. And Keynes ended up coming up with this theory that the gold standard was a barbarous relic of olden times, and it didn't take into account modern economies and how he argued two things that were important to money. One was money shouldn't be tied to gold, and when it's not tied to gold, you can increase or decrease the money supply to either slow down economic activity so you don't have inflation, or increase the money supply and use that to stimulate the economy, which gets to a second part, and that is that there's a role for government to play in economic prosperity. And through government stimulus, you can help countries out of an economic tight spot. Well, FDR really took a hold of this. And when he ran for election against Herbert Hoover, it was within the context of the Great Depression. So Great Depression had happened through Black Tuesday in 1929. Things got worse. Herbert Hoover was the president at the time, and he took a fairly conservative approach. He believed in the gold standard was sacred, and as a result, the government didn't have money for stimulus, and he didn't believe the government ought to be stimulating the economy anyway. The economy ought to repair itself through the free market. And what that means is a certain period of time where there's a lot of disruption and dislocation, but eventually the bad assets disappear, the good assets get acquired by better companies, the market reorders itself, and things will stabilize and improve. Well, he did not, his policies, as typical in economics, didn't result in immediate results, and FDR ran on the platform of the government ought to take a much stronger role in helping out all these hurting Americans, what he called the forgotten man. Wall Street was doing quite well in that early part of that recovery under Hoover, but Main Street wasn't. And so he campaigned on the forgotten man, promised job programs and government stimulus. And when he got elected, found out that all the money that was in circulation that the gold had backed had already been printed, and he didn't have any additional gold reserves in the United States to back the printing of more money. So how are you going to fund these programs and get rid of the gold standard? So he's revitalized an old executive order. And what that executive order did, which was created originally in World War I, was to force all Americans to give up all their monetary gold. So what that meant was currency was either gold coins that you had, which went as low as $2.50 and as high as $20, or they were banknotes that were either gold or silver certificates, which you could take into a federal bank and convert that note into the appropriate amount of gold or silver. And so with using this executive order, Americans who were much more trusting of the government back then turned in their monetary gold in droves. And literally overnight, the American government's gold supply tripled. So what does that mean? That means that FDR could triple the amount of money being printed by the government. And he used that money to basically fund the New Deal. Further, needing more, he unilaterally devalued the dollar, which was based on the gold standard of $20 an ounce, and the whole world was on this standard. And in the United States, he reduced that value of gold from $20 an ounce to $35 an ounce. So then, in addition to tripling the government's ability to print money, he then doubled that tripled capacity by reducing the value of gold to each dollar. And so you can imagine, if you were a citizen, you traded in a $20 gold coin, and now you got a $20 note for it, but that note could never be traded back for another gold coin. And then you found out a year, if you would have waited a year, you would have gotten $35 of a paper note instead of $20. So in one fell swoop, Roosevelt basically started on a path of getting rid of the gold standard and then increased the money supply so that he could fund fiscal stimulus into the economy. Which, by the way, one of the things that the United States Mint does is it provides oversight and protection to Fort Knox. And Fort Knox was built started building it in 1935, finished at the end of 1935, and beginning in 1936, started storing all the gold that was being brought in. They needed a place to store it. And so they built Fort Knox as a safe in order to do that. So that wasn't the end of the gold standard. It took two other events to finally put a death to it. One was Bretton Woods. So Bretton Woods is a city in Vermont that about 45 finance ministers from all the allied countries gathered in 1944 and basically said this: we all went off the gold standard so that we could print a whole bunch of money so we could fund World War II. And now that it looks like we're going to win the war, how are we going to reconcile this? Because we printed way more money than the world has gold for. So we need to figure this out. And in the end, they came to two conclusions. One is we want United States goods because they're going to be the only industrial base left standing of high capacity. And if we're going to rebuild, we're going to need US goods to do it. And we're going to need US dollars to buy that. And so there's going to be a huge need for US dollars. And so maybe we can do kind of a half gold standard or de facto gold standard and have the US dollar based in gold, and all the other countries would base their currency on the US dollar. And that was the seminal point of how the dollar became the world's became the world's reserve currency. And so Bretton Woods started this pseudo gold standard, of which any country having US dollars could trade that in for the appropriate amount of gold. But citizens themselves would not be able to do that. They had to deal strictly with a fiat currency. And then the final blow came in 1972, commonly called the Nixon Shock. And that was as Nixon was trying to stimulate the economy using Keynesian theory, trying to expand the money supply beyond what gold we had to back. A lot of countries that were holding dollars panicked that their dollars would not be able to buy as much gold. And so these countries started cashing in their dollars for gold at a frenzied pace. Within 9 months, the US gold reserves went from roughly 21,000 tons to about 10,000 tons. And by the Nixon shock in 1972, Nixon cut off all these countries. And we were left with roughly 8,103 tons of gold left in our vaults. And all these countries were then holding dollars that were yet to be redeemed for that gold, and there wasn't enough to go around. And so even today on the United States Mint's books, all that gold in Fort Knox, and we have it in 2 other locations, both in West Point and in Denver, all that gold is on our books at $42.22, which is when Nixon, that was the price of gold when Nixon prevented other countries from cashing that gold. So we still have that obligation, and that obligation is on the books at $42.22 per ounce. That put an end to the gold standard. And since then, the world has been mostly, except for some situations like the Swiss franc until recently, the rest of the world went off whatever semblance of the pseudo gold standard was, and we've had free floating fiat currencies since then. It is called fiat because by government fiat or by their law, you have to value this 4-cent piece of paper for $100 or $1 or $20. That's why it says legal tender on these dollars instead of gold certificate. So let me get to the last piece here, and that is the birth of Bitcoin. So that'll be my 4th birth, and you've already experienced the death. And that was in 2009, there was a white paper written pseudonymously under the name Satoshi Nakamoto that posited if we could create currency from scratch, and that currency would make use of all modern technology, including the internet and advances in cryptography, and would be private, decentralized versus government centralization, what would that look like? And so then a team of programmers decided to make that into reality. And then Bitcoin was birthed a couple years after the white paper. And to me, it's interesting because I can't separate the Satoshi white paper from the context of the financial crisis, when many countries used unprecedented amounts of increasing monetary supply, quantitative easing, to stimulate the economy. And then there was great concern over whether or not that's the right policies. And a private sector question came up saying, well, the private sector basically uses money as a way of account and as a method of exchange for goods and services. And why should our ability to manage our own business affairs be so manipulated by the government, which in essence has a monopoly on it? And so in my terms, Bitcoin rose up from a policy perspective as a private sector competition to government's monopoly on money. And so the key elements behind Bitcoin were, it was decentralized across the internet, meaning it was powered and the distribution went to literally hundreds of thousands, if not millions of computers all over the world. It was based on a technological innovation called the blockchain, and that it relied on advanced cryptography that resulted in common language in public and private keys to maintain the highest amount of security for all those transactions. And it's unclear as to whether Bitcoin will become that major private sector competitor to government's monopoly on money, or whether cryptocurrency 2.0 or 3.0 will end up being that, or whether the future, in my opinion, will look more like a basket or portfolio of different currencies and different payment systems where consumers pick the ones that are most convenient and secure for the type of transaction that they're going to make. And so with that, I have taken up roughly half an hour, and I think I have about 15 minutes to answer any of your questions. Some things that I didn't discuss range from the role of precious metal bullion, which, by the way, gold is about to break the historic high set in 2011. The global war on cash, government's war on cash, to Article 1, Section 10 of the US Constitution that allows states to allow their citizens to settle debts in gold and silver, and there's 14 different states that are pursuing that. So I can talk about any of those or anything else that's on your mind that's not on that list. So I'm going to turn it back to Chris, who will be the moderator.
Excellent. Yeah. So if you would like to ask questions, please just pop them into the Q&A panel. It looks like they're starting to come in now. But I'd like to just get, Ed, your kind of snapshot diagnosis of the monetary health or unhealth of the United States. I mean, this has been really almost bewildering how much, how the balance sheets for the country have changed in the last few years. Can you give us your kind of snapshot diagnosis of what's happening and where it might go from here?
Yes. It's a really good and relevant question to what's going on currently, Chris. And the short answer to that is people always point to the strength of the dollar and how people still want it. All these countries use it as part of their reserves. And what I point out is, especially since the financial crisis to today, the dollar's strength is relative to the weakness of all the other currencies and the weakness of the dollar. And so I heard it best described once as the dollar is the cleanest shirt in the dirty shirt hamper. And I really do think, so when you just take a look at it, when the Fed did basically 3.5 rounds of quantitative easing during the last financial crisis, they added $4.5 trillion to the money supply. If anyone can venture a guess as to how large the money supply of US dollars globally, both in paper and electronic, are, if you've come close to 10 trillion, you're pretty close to the mark. So they inflated the number of dollars by 40%, chasing the same amount of goods. And they did that over the course of 5.5 years. In this pandemic economic crisis, the Fed, through a new quantitative easing program, has created $2.2 trillion in 4 months. So we're on pace for maybe a $10 trillion or doubling the amount of dollars available by the time this pandemic reaches its peak.
And here's the follow-up question to that before we take one of the audience questions is, classical monetary theory, in my knowledge, would dictate that doubling the money supply would be lead to kind of inflation or hyperinflation, and yet inflation is at a record low. Can you unpack that paradox or apparent contradiction?
Yes. So inflation, so when you increase the money supply by 40%, chasing the same amount of goods, you would assume that there would be 40% inflation if all the money flowed through the economy. But how the money flowed mattered to how whether or not we got inflation. And so that money, through quantitative easing, mainly goes to banks, not to individuals. So banks aren't buying goods and services. And through Dodd-Frank, it made it magnitudes more difficult for banks to loan that money to individuals and to businesses. Take, for example, Ben Bernanke, my colleague who is chairman of the Fed. When he left the Fed and he started getting $250,000 per speech, he racked up like $3 million of fees in a few short months, went to get his house refinanced, and the bank wouldn't give it to him because he had not, as a self-employed person, wasn't self-employed for more than 3 years, where he had 3 years of financial history and all this other stuff. And so bottom line is, most of that money stayed with the banks, got pumped into the stock market, or got invested in emerging economies. It didn't go to people. And so as a result, goods and services weren't bought, and that's why we had a fairly weak recovery, and there was very little inflation. And this also gets back to this notion of the Fed was initially created to have stable prices, but the Fed's view or definition of stable prices have changed from the same price, which was the predominant economic theory under the gold standard, to 2% inflation a year. And what the 2% inflation theoretically is supposed to do is when demand outstrips supply, then you have inflation because you have more dollars chasing, goods that are trying to catch up, and 2% inflation shows a growing economy. Whereas in the past, under the gold standard, you wanted that loaf of bread to be worth 10 cents forever. So if you earned $10,000 instead of $5,000, your buying power doubled because now you can get more stuff for it. But the modern theory of economic growth is built in inflation in the cost of goods.
Great. And for the final question, we got a couple folks, Mac and Clara and others, that are asking, I think if I could summarize them and put them into a composite question, what does the conflict between central banks and decentralized banks, let's say Bitcoin, cryptocurrency, how is that fight going to play out in your prediction? Maybe you can offer us some prognostication.
Yeah. So let's see. So I'll do a couple quick bullet points and maybe we can handle another question. So bullet point number one is private sector currency transactions is infinitesimally small, so central banks don't care, except they monitor it to see what the trends and what they can co-opt out of these ideas, right? And so that's one. So basically zero at this point. Ed Moy's prediction of the future is what I said before, is I think there will be a basket or a portfolio of different currencies and different payment systems that each consumer will have choices when they make a purchase or use that because they want to use the one that's best. So for example, if you want to buy a flat screen TV, in the past, you would have to pay cash for it or a credit or a check. Now you can use a credit card. I'm not going to use $1,001 bills to go buy a flat screen TV anymore. But at the same time, if you're making a certain type of international transaction, an ETF is going to be the most efficient way of doing it. And so you got all these options. They'll ebb and flow as far as their market share, with growing market share toward electronic and digital transactions.
Great. And then for the last question, we have a couple minutes before we go to the next session. Mike has a question about modern monetary theory. Can you kind of comment on that? It's gone from what was maybe dismissed as a kooky, wild idea to now being discussed in some of the highest positions of power, and especially in the progressive side of politics. Right. What is it, and what should we think? Yeah.
Okay, so modern monetary theory, in short, and I'm not giving it full, I'm not describing it with full academic integrity, but it's basically, it's money, it's government, it's the United States. We're not going to go bankrupt anytime soon, so why not print as much as you want? That's AOC. Let's print trillions of dollars and let's just take care of the deficit. And then we can use extra money to do this and do that with. So this is my answer to that. A country that tried this was Zimbabwe. And Zimbabwe has the infamous distinction of having the highest denominated circulating notes ever. And what I just showed you was a $100 trillion bill that might have been worth $10 when it first came out and isn't even worth the paper it's printed on today.
Well, I think we all, though, rest in some comfort that everyone in Zimbabwe is now a trillionaire. That's quite helpful, at least linguistically. So Ed, this was amazing. I learned a lot, and I know from the comments coming in, your perspective is much appreciated. Thank you so much. And for all of you listening, we're going to be transitioning. We're going to take a few minutes break, and then Jay Richards is going to be tackling the toughest topic of the day, the COVID-19 pandemic, and he's going to be giving his kind of counterintuitive thoughts on that. So thanks to Ed. Thanks you all for joining. We'll see you back in a few minutes.